Hey everyone, so this week we're going to do a little bit of wrapping up of odds and ends, some things that have come up during previous assignments that we didn't necessarily have a lot of time to go over, as well as adding a little bit more versatility and functionality to the visualizations that you all are already building. So I know you had an awesome time playing with maps, working with maps with Joanna last week, but we're back to boring old charts again this week, but starting to dig into the details of how we can refine them and really start to work closely with the formatting so that we really get the visualization and the annotation that we're looking for. So we here have my beautifully hideous column chart, and I want to talk about something that came up for a few of you, not in last week's assignment obviously, but the week before, which had to do once again with kind of our data formats. So this isn't something that we talked about because it's not a distinct format in, well actually I guess it is technically, it's a data type, but because it doesn't change much we don't talk about it very often, and that is date formats. So one thing that came up for some of you was trying to apply something that wasn't showing up because these dates at the bottom of our chart, while they render out in this sort of year, month, day format, aren't really dates, in that the computer doesn't understand that these are things that can be manipulated as dates, right? And that makes sense because, first of all, they're in this kind of unusual format. We talked about that comes out of databases a lot. It is a good date format for that reason, but more saliently, if we look at the part where we add the column that has that information in it, of course I really should call this, date, and what are we looking at here? I think we're looking at some sort of GDP data. Should have better documentation for that. But we're actually saying that it's a string, right, not a date. So it's not surprising that when we try to do things that rely on a date format or require dates, continuous data was the thing that kept coming up, was, oh, the thing that you have is not continuous data, right? And strings, we can understand, right, aren't continuous in the sense that you could have two strings, if they're strings, they could just as easily be labels for different varieties of something, as even though in our case they look like dates, those are quote unquote discrete, right? It's viewing them as categories, like category labels, rather than as dates. And so in order for it to understand that this is actually continuous data, i.e. a time series, that it makes sense to do kind of like addition and subtraction on, if you will, we have to actually tell it that this is a date. So we can get started with this by simply saying that, by the way, the format, the data format of this is a date. But that's actually not going to quite do the trick for us, as we saw when we have, because of course our data here that's coming out of Fred, we see all these double quotes, we know actually these are all strings, right? So if we look back at how we handled this when it came to our sort of GDP data, if you remember up here in our for loop, we actually used this number function to quote unquote cast that string value as a number, right? So basically saying, look, I know that this data looks, it's in a string format, but I know that there's it's a string of digits. So please interpret these as digits. We can do something similar with the date, but we actually have to use the new keyword here. And the reason why we have to do that kind of gets into the arcane details of JavaScript. It's not super important. It's not really important that you understand the difference why. But just know that when you're working with dates, if you have them in that sort of 4-year, 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day format, that you're going to need to use this new keyword. Unfortunately, there's no way for us to be consistent about it. We cannot actually say new number here. So just make a note to yourself. This would be a great time for a comment. Have to use the new keyword with dates. And how do we know that it's a keyword? Again, our typography helps us there. New sort of highlights in this golden color, as do date and number, right, when they're highlighted like this. So if we do this, we're not going to see off the bat, we're not going to see a big change. Oh, we'll see some change on the front end. There you go. So it's now interpreted. It's by default showing this sort of short year thing. Now, having done this, we can now start to apply some of the things that you all were looking at in your assignments, one of which, sorry, looking for a template here, were trend lines, right? So trend lines, which I've lost, trend line, right? No. Oh, I got all lost here. Let's go back. That a trend line was something that you can apply, for example, to a column chart. So I'm going to look in the configuration options of column charts for trend lines. And this is just an example. This is not to say that actually very often trend lines are actually not the kind of thing that we probably want to use a lot because it is it's doing sort of a kind of statistical inference that we may or may not, we wouldn't want to apply to a visualization without some pretty expert assistance. And by expert, I mean a qualified statistician telling us that that's something that's applicable to do. You'll see this also if you when you start using the line charts. Some of the templates by default have smoothing in them. Smoothing is not something we want to use either. It makes the line sort of, it does just that, right? Instead of being jaggy, it's smooth, but that's implying things about the data that we are probably not in a position to actually do. So just to show how I can do this with the trend lines example, again, I'm just copying the text from the example here, copying the example. I'm going to come here to my Google Style Objects file, which I find very handy. So I'm going to call this my trend, right? Set this to the object. Okay, and then when I come back to my scripts.js, if I wanted to add this, I have my options object here, so I would still need to add the empty trend lines object as we have with h-axis and v-axis. And then down here again, I would just sort of do my classic options.trendlines equals my trend, right? So I'm able to separate out these style objects. And if all has gone according to plan, then there's my trend line, right? Of course, this legend is completely nonsensical. So again, not to say it's impossible that you'll need this, but it's unlikely. And of course, we would need to improve the legend situation in that case too, which the legends can definitely be overridden by yet more configuration options. The other thing that I wanted to address with this goes to the sort of date formatting here, right? So there are a bunch of things you'll see when you start looking at the h-axis configuration options, things like rotating the labels, so the ability to rotate the labels by degrees. So I think, let's see, slanted text, here we go. So I can go ahead and set this. I'm not sure, this will be interesting to see if the discrete, if it will work with my dates here. But I want to touch on something else actually, which is formatters. So we saw that once I changed it to a date format, that that instead of showing this sort of whole 4-digit thing, I'm now down to sort of just 4-digit years. And that's okay for here perhaps, but it's worth knowing how to be able to express those dates differently. So you'll see that there's a reference on formatters. Fortunately for us, the example is about dates. And so the issue is that the formatter is kind of like a different kind of, it's like sort of like another options object. It isn't actually the options object, but this is how we get to it. So we create a new formatter, which again is just a variable, but it's a variable that we're calling on some functions from the Google library. So I'm going to call this date formatter, and so Google visualization date format, and then it's saying format type long. Now this is where does this long come from? This again is something that the Google visualization library has assigned, that this is how it's described, and actually in the documentation, if we go down here to date format, it gives us the sort of keywords and what they look like, right? So we can get a time for that, and then you can get really into it with this pattern thing and sort of you know, you look at this specification for date and time format. But for our purposes, we can go ahead and, I mean, just as an example, I'm going to go ahead and use the short one since that seems more appropriate. So instead of long, I'll have short in here. And then I need to apply it. So the thing about the date formatter, the thing about the formatter in general, right, is actually that it doesn't get applied, is that I apply it to the data table. So the date formatter is going to apply to a specific column of data rather than the options object, which sort of applies to the entire chart, right? It has to do with the sort of metadata and axes, labels, and legend, and things that have to do with the chart as a whole. Formatters apply to individual columns of data. So I'm going to want to define this, first of all, above where I create my data table here. And secondly, when I apply it, I'm going to apply it to a particular column of the data table. So this is where I say formatter.format, and data in this case, this is a little confusing the way they label it, but data is actually the data table. So I'm going to say, okay, down here, well, I guess I could have put it, I can sort of put it wherever I like, but well, I have to apply it after that. So date formatter. So then I'm going to say, I'm going to say date formatter.format. So date formatter format, right? And I'm going to say data, right, which is actually my data table. This would make more sense if I called it data table, so I'm going to call it data, but I have it called data. And then the number of the column to which it applies. So in our case, it's column 0, right? So this is the 0th column. And so I'll put 0 in here. And if this worked correctly, then I should see the sort of slash format for my dates on my chart when I reload the page. Oh, fail. Let's see what went wrong. So our date formatter didn't take, and I futzed around a little bit trying to see what was going on. So this is why I think we mentioned in class once that dealing with dates is really annoying. So one of the reasons is that, so it looked, when I said new date here, it looked like it was actually interpreting that entire big string that we have, which is, you know, this 2013-814, that it was actually interpreting that and converting it to a date. In point of fact, what it's actually doing is it's just grabbing the year. And so when I try to change the format of the date, it sort of doesn't understand what's going on. And so the way that, what it means is basically that if I want to have a better formatted date, which of course I do, then I'm going to need to create a placeholder array that is going to actually take my original data, right? So it's the date column, but we know that it's a string. And I'm going to apply something called this, I'm going to apply the split function to it. And split basically says look for this character and split on it, so break the string into pieces based on that delimiter, and it will create an array. And that array will have in it, you know, the first position will be the year, and then the month, and then the day, right? Because that's how our thing is organized. And then when we come to new date, we can use we can actually use the numbers in that array to generate a proper date that we can then create a proper format from. So I'm just going to double check here, because I really forget how to do this, what that looks like. So we can see an example here where it says, so it's basically year, month, day, and I'm going to actually have to cast these separately as well. So I'm going to have to say something like number, date, array, 0, comma, number, date, array. Let's see if I can beat the clock here. 1, comma, so many nested things here. I don't even know if that's going to work because I feel like I'm going to have an error, but we'll see what happens. Oh, disasterification. All right, in the next video, we'll wrap that up and get that working. But I think you can see hopefully sort of where that's going. So hang tight, and I will see you all in a minute.